Welcome to part 2 of Exploring the Doctrine of Discovery with the Reverend Dr. Mary Crist, Indigenous Theological Education Coordinator for the Episcopal Church. We're delighted that you've joined us. If you have not already watched part 1, I invite you to find that video on the Episcopal Diocese of Alaska YouTube channel. And now, Dr. Mary Crist and Exploring the Doctrine of Discovery, Part 2.
Thank you for coming back to attend the second session of this. I hope it'll be helpful to you. We'll also be doing a bit of a sprint given the time, but I hope that if you have any questions as we go through, jot them down because we will have time at the end. So thank you for being here. Last week, we discussed the documents comprising the doctrine of discovery, the indigenous people affected by it all around the world, and why it is important for us to know about it. Today, we will explore more about how the doctrine of discovery affected the legal system in the US and elsewhere, some famous legal cases that are still consulted today in decision-making regarding tribal peoples and their land, and what hope there is for healing and reconciliation. We will also touch upon what happened in Alaska related to the doctrine of discovery. Let us begin with this prayer, a prayer for healing and hope. O great Spirit, God of all people and every tribe, through whom all people are related, call us to the kinship of all your people. Grant us vision to see through the lens of our baptismal covenant, the brokenness of the past. Help us to listen to you and to one another in order to heal the wounds of the present. And give us courage, patience, and wisdom to work together for healing and hope with all of your people, now and in the future. Mend the hoop of our hearts and let us live in justice and peace through Jesus Christ, the one who comes to all people that we might live in dignity. Amen. Why care about the doctrine of discovery today? Well, it's important because, for one, it destroyed access to the lands held and cared for thousands of years by Native people. As we discussed in the first session, to Native people, the land is not just ground. It's not just soil. For us, the earth is our mother. Land is foundational to Indigenous spirituality and culture. And without access to it, many of us feel that a significant part of our connection to Creator is broken. The doctrine of discovery made it legal for Christian Europeans to take the land. It also led to the establishment of laws and practices that still affect Native people today. Many people believe the doctrine of discovery should be called the doctrine of dominion, while others refer to it as the doctrine of Christian domination. The doctrine of discovery inspired legal changes that destroyed how Indigenous people of the Americas and elsewhere related to the land and to the new people coming from Europe. 3 of these changes are significant: the Monroe Doctrine, the Supreme Court case known as Johnson versus McIntosh, and the movement called Manifest Destiny. Let us consider these in a bit more detail. The Monroe Doctrine was proclaimed in 1823, but the term Monroe Doctrine was not used until 1850. This doctrine was used to justify the American occupation and governance of all the land from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean in the lower 48. The Monroe Doctrine made it clear to other countries that they could no longer come into the Americas and take over the land. Any intervention by a foreign power was potentially a hostile act against the United States. Johnson versus McIntosh. This was an important Supreme Court case settled in 1823, and to this day, Marshall's majority decision in Johnson versus McIntosh forms the legal foundation for property ownership in the United States. The dispute was between two non-natives who each claimed they owned Indian land. Johnson had bought the land from the federal government, and McIntosh had bought it directly from the Plankashaw natives. The ruling established that no one could buy land directly from native people because their land was owned by the United States government, who got it from England following the American Revolution. The natives could occupy the land, but not own it. This discovery, Doctrine of Discovery, made the federal government the owner of all indigenous land. In a case in 1831 called the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, the Supreme Court stated that the Cherokee Nation was not fully sovereign. It was, quote unquote, from the ruling, maybe, perhaps, a, quote, domestic dependent nation. The US government interpreted this ruling to mean that the federal government held absolute legislative authority over Indian nations, the legal term being plenary power. This ruling extended the Doctrine of Discovery's power over so-called heathen Indians into a doctrine that the US Constitution allows governmental authority over Indian nations and their lands. You see, this issue of sovereignty was very, very important because when the native people gave up their land, as many did, not voluntarily in most cases, but under duress, they were told that the land that they retained was theirs as a sovereign nation. So all of these rulings and many treaties that followed actually undid that sovereignty. Now, Manifest Destiny came in 1872. This is known as the birth of exceptionalism. Some people call it the birth of white supremacy. I realize that's offensive to many folks, and so I'm reporting it as a historic term that was used, and I want to tell you about this painting that you'll see, and I want you to look at it closely. In 1872, the artist John Gast represented the people moving westward, being led by a very white angelic figure that captured the view of Americans at the time. This was sometimes called the Spirit of the Frontier painting, and it was widely distributed. This engraving portrayed settlers moving westward, guided and protected by Columbia, who was lighting their way, and aided by technology of transportation not available to the natives. And at that time, you can see the covered wagons. On the other hand, the natives were being driven into obscurity. And if you look over to the left-hand side of the painting, you'll see that while the pioneers advanced forward energetically, the indigenous people and the buffalo were entering into darkness. They would not survive this movement without sacrifice of land and life. In 1845, the newspaper editor John O'Sullivan coined the term manifest destiny to describe the essence of this mindset. At the heart of manifest destiny was the pervasive belief in American cultural and racial superiority. Native Americans had long been perceived as inferior, and efforts to civilize them had been widespread since the days of John Smith and Miles Standish. This also affected, by the way, the Latino people who ruled Texas, and the lucrative ports of California were also seen as backward. Remember last week we used the term terra nullius to describe that if the land was not occupied by Christian people, it was considered empty. Now, the lives of the people who did occupy it were acknowledged as living beings, but not on the par with human beings coming in to colonize. Actually, they were thought, and I have references where this is in writing, the native people were often referred to as bears or dogs, and they were considered to be on the same par as the flora and fauna of the land that they occupied. Now, just to show you how this comes into the present is a case called the City of Sherrill and the Oneida Indian Nation of New York. And this was settled at the Supreme Court in 2005. What happened was the Oneida Nation purchased land on the open market that it had originally owned as part of the setting up of its reservation, but had sold the land. So the native people held the land, then sold the land to outsiders. The Oneida Nation claimed that the reacquired land would be exempt from taxation in the same way that the remaining acreage of the reservation was exempt from taxation. But the court held that repurchasing traditional lands 200 years later did not restore tribal sovereignty to that land. Therefore, the land, even though it had been reacquired, could still be taxed by the city of Sherrill, New York. Now, this was back to that doctrine of discovery belief that the native people could live on the land, but not have rights over selling the land or reacquiring the land or dealing with things that happened on the land. McGirt versus Oklahoma in 2020 was a case where a man had been accused of sexual improprieties. I don't have all the details, but it was a sexual abuse case. And he claimed that he could not be tried in Oklahoma because the offenses took place on Indian land, and that he was therefore entitled to be tried by Indian court, or if not Indian court, it had to go directly to the United States government because that was what the treaties called for. So in resolving this, the US Supreme Court wrote that the legislature wields significant constitutional authority when it comes to tribal nations, possessing even the authority to breach its own promises and treaties. So in other words, what was promised in the past might or might not still hold, and it would be considered legal. As it was, the offender was remanded to federal court and was tried in federal courts. Our time is limited today, but it is important to present the effects of forced assimilation via the boarding school system. The devastating effects of families having to give over their children, some as young as 4 or 5 years, to Indian agents who took them away to boarding schools where the intent was to eradicate any connections with their Indian culture. Those effects are still seen today. I have a 4-minute video here, but I'm not going to show it right now. It may be something that I can send you the link if you're interested in seeing it, but suffice it to say, my grandmother and her sisters were part of this reality. Only one of her sisters was taken out of the state, as many young children were, but all of them were sent to school away from home, just not out of state. The assimilation attempts were profound. For example, I never saw my grandmother in her Blackfeet regalia. She never taught her language to my mother. because she wanted my mother not to be punished for using this native language. She did share stories with me as her granddaughter, but my mother was considered part of what we call the skipped generation, when cultural treasures were deeply hidden away from the children to prevent them from being punished for using them, or worse, to prevent those treasures from being completely taken away. This is the picture of the student body on the campus of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, about 1890. Carlisle was the flagship residential school for Indigenous children, with assimilation and training as its objective. Indigenous children from all over the country were sent there to live. Some of them were taken away from their families, never to return. The superintendent of the school was Captain Richard Henry Pratt, whose motto was, "Kill the Indian in order to save the man." Now, Richard Pratt had a military background, so you can see that the children were dressed in uniforms. They marched to and from classes. They lived in dormitories, and in many of the schools, the children were assigned a number which replaced their name. So they were not called ever again by their name. They were called by their number. And I have heard from some of the elders in Alaska, and one of them being Anna Frank, the retired archdeacon, that she has heard some of her friends still call their other friends and relatives from their past by the number. So these people knew their number and went by the number instead of the name. You can see here a plaque, a historic plaque that has been placed there. Over 10,000 Indigenous children attended this school between 1879 and 1918. Despite idealistic beginnings, the school left a mixed and lasting legacy, creating opportunity for some students and conflicted identities for others. In this cemetery are 186 graves of students who died while attending Carlisle Indian School. Now, you have heard of this, I'm sure, a similar thing in Alaska, because there were several boarding schools in Alaska. This is not to indict every single school, because some were, well, frankly, more injurious to the children than others. But it is to describe a movement that forced children. Anna told me that in Minto, when she was growing up, that there came a time when the planes came to pick up all the young children from Minto. And she and three boys, there were four of them, were considered too old to go on the plane. So they were left behind in the village of Minto. Anna was 15 at the time. The other children were taken away on the plane. And she describes in her interview how it hurt her heart, how sad she was to see all the children of the village taken away to school. Some went to boarding school, some of the older ones went down to Wrangell, and some never came back. And some, when they did come back, she said, didn't really fit in anymore, because if they went away when they were 5 or 6 years old, when they came back, they didn't really know any of the culture and they didn't have friends there. So they were changed forever through this boarding school movement. This is a picture of the marker of the Indian Cemetery at Carlisle Indian School. This is a photo of the cemetery where 186 Indigenous students died while at the school. Interestingly enough, repatriation efforts have since begun, and some of the remains have been returned to their homelands, including one case in 2019 where the bodies of 3 little girls were returned to the Oneida Reservation in Wisconsin. Some of the names of the children who died are known along with their tribal membership, and you can see them carved on the headstones. But sadly, other children's names were not recorded. Their graves are marked as unknown. I mean, as a grandmother and a mother, I just can't imagine how devastating that had to have been to the parents of these little ones who went away and died and their names were not even known. This case was reported in the Missoulian newspaper in Montana about a child named George L., who was taken when he was 6 years old, and he was taken away to boarding school away from the Blackfeet Indian Reservation in Montana. He was placed aboard a train and transported more than 2,000 miles to Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania. He died there a little more than 1 year later. His parents, Louis and Mary L., were not told of their son's death until a year after he had been buried. The federal government refused to return his remains to Montana. In this undated photo, Dale L. poses for a photo at the family cemetery outside Browning, Montana on the Blackfeet Indian Reservation. His uncle George L. will be reburied there Saturday after a 128-year absence from the land. In 1862, the U.S. Dakota War erupted, an event that left lasting scars there. Sparked by broken treaty promises, the war left hundreds dead, brought about the largest mass execution. It was the hanging of the 38 in Mankato, Minnesota, and it led to the expulsion of the Dakota people from Minnesota. This photo shows the transformation of Lakota boys before and after their arrival at Carlisle Indian School. The assimilation and acculturation process is evident. It came with unspeakable personal cost to the children. So if you look at the boys on the left in their beautiful portrait, you will see that one of the young men is wearing an eagle feather, which is signifying that he has already gone through a rite of passage and is considered a young man, a young adult man among his people. He would probably be old enough to be married and start his own household. Another boy on the left is also wearing an eagle feather, which signifies a great deal of responsibility and respect that he carries from his tribal people. On the photo on the right, you can see very, very different photo. Uniforms, military style, haircut, no feathers, no regalia, no furs, nothing that would separate them from any of the other young men at the school. They have been completely assimilated into a system that was totally different. And you can see how they would have trouble when they go home being accepted. They didn't really fit in anymore. The doctrine of discovery and the earth. Most people don't realize the damage that was done physically to the earth by all of the people who died. The great dying during colonization led to something we call the Little Ice Age. It is likely that no one here today has thought much, if anything, about the ecological devastation caused as a result of the doctrine of discovery. But here it is. we'll see a short video that summarizes what happened to the Earth's temperature as the result of the death of 55 million indigenous peoples following the landing of Columbus in 1492. It is called the Little Ice Age. Previously, the Little Ice Age of the 17th century was thought to have been caused by volcanic activity around the globe. But in 2019, a group of scientists and statisticians in London published an article showing that the volcanic activity was insufficient to have caused this cooling.
Scientists may finally have an answer to what caused the Little Ice Age of the 17th century. A new study claims that roughly 50% of a global cooling effect during that era was caused by the loss of 90% of 60 million indigenous lives during European colonization of the Americas.
Most sources point towards a number of 6 million people, like indigenous people living in the Americas. So from 60.5 to 6 million people, that's how we then arrived at the 90% depopulation.
According to the study, Christopher Columbus kicked off European colonization when he landed in 1492. 55 million indigenous people across the Americas died over the next century through events like genocide and disease. That removed millions of carbon producers from the equation and left an estimated 56 million hectares of land vacant.
This population practiced a substantial amount of agriculture. That obviously then had an impact on land management. So there was not enough workforce available to actually manage these fields anymore, which means forest returns or natural vegetation returns.
Nature then reclaimed that land, and the massive jump in plant life and photosynthesis absorbed 7.4 petagrams, or 7 billion metric tons of carbon from the atmosphere, and converted that to oxygen and sugar. Those factors resulted in a cooling of the atmosphere. Winters in the Little Ice Age averaged 2 degrees colder than the modern era.
We can't really even talk about apologies or moving forward until we see that full accountability. And boy, someone's got to account for this.
Dr. Pamela Palmater is a well-known activist and faculty member at Toronto's Ryerson University. She told Global News that population figures supported by science have a high value, and Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission should take note.
This report substantiates what, the chair of the TRC said, that it wasn't just cultural genocide that Canada committed here. It was also physical and biological. This kind of, scientific hard data shows just how extensive the genocide was, and that means something different for Truth and Reconciliation. There's never been a real accountability for what happened. We just say, we had these good policies and oops, they went wrong. Instead of actually saying, this many people died. This is what we did. These are the people that we sterilized. These are the people that we scalped. These are the people that we murdered. And here's the impact to the earth, to the people, and to us. What does it mean for us as a society?
Scientists may find...
I found that absolutely fascinating. That's why I wanted to include it. I had never read anything like that, and it wasn't published until 2019 in March. I do have the original article. I'd be happy to send it to you as a PDF if you're interested in seeing more about it. Now, Alaska, here I am, a Southern Californian who grew up in Texas and who's enrolled in a tribe in Montana. I would be embarrassed to begin to tell you a whole lot about Alaska and the doctrine of discovery. I'm sure you know much more than I, but I'm going to just touch a few bullet points to let you know that it affected Alaska as well. Here is a timeline narrative showing some of the early colonization milestones in Alaska, beginning in 1728 with Vitus Bering sighting St. Lawrence Island. By 1778, Captain James Cook had begun exploring the Arctic Ocean. And 6 years later, in 1784, the first white settlement in Alaska had been established on Kodiak Island. 6 years after that, Alexander Baranov became the director of the Russian settlement, and by 1799, Tsar Paul claimed Alaska as a Russian possession. He became the first governor of Alaska, and following a Monroe Doctrine type plan, the Russian Navy barred all foreign ships from Alaskan waters in 1818. But by 1835, the US and England had obtained trading privileges in Alaska. And by 1843, the first mission school was set up by the Greek Orthodox Church in Nushagak for the Yupik and Athabaskan peoples living in that area. In the US, the doctrine of discovery was interpreted to mean that there would be federal recognition, inherent sovereignty of Indian tribes, and that the settlement of lands and subsistence resources with the tribes. In the lower 48 states, Aboriginal land claims were mainly settled through treaty making with the Indians. This picture shows negotiations at the Fort Laramie Peace Treaty, which ended Red Cloud's War in 1868, about the time of the Civil War ending. This was one of the last major treaties signed before Congress voted to end US treaty making with Indian tribal nations. For thousands of years, Alaska natives had controlled their own land, provided themselves clothing and shelter, and taken food from the sea as well as through hunting. But in 1867, Russia sold, quote unquote, Alaska to the United States, even though neither country actually owned Alaska. Americans colonized the land, building towns and salmon canneries, and the discovery of gold changed things even more dramatically. In 1871, Congress ended the practice of treaty making, shortly after purchasing Alaska from the Russians. Now, this act ended a nearly 100-year-old diplomatic tradition in which the United States recognized tribes as nations, sovereign nations. Although Congress agreed to honor the approximately 368 Indian treaties that had already been ratified from 1778 to 1868, Congress also stated unequivocally that, quote, henceforth, no Indian nation or tribe shall be acknowledged or recognized as an independent nation, tribe, or power with whom the United States may contract by treaty. So treaties were gone. 100 years later, Alaska native land claims were settled. It took 100 years till 1971 for Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act to be passed. I'm sure you're familiar with it because in this approach, it did avoid setting up reservations in Alaska, and the native people did not lose their land in the way that the indigenous people of the lower 48 lost theirs. They were not forcibly removed to areas that weren't even close to where they had grown up. They were given control over their land and cash for all assets received through the settlement. What was set up are Alaska Native corporations that were for profit. They were to be socially responsible agencies that would operate to promote social, cultural, and economic development to benefit Alaska Native people and their communities in perpetuity. This act resolved land claim conflicts over oil rights in Alaska in the 1960s and paved the way for pipelines to be built on native land. In the 50 years since Congress passed ANSCA, Alaska Native people have built successful corporate operations on the foundation of Alaska Native values. Profits from these Alaska Native corporations are used to care for elders, educate youth, assist communities, create jobs, and perpetuate cultural heritage for generations to come. Now, this leads us to just a mini discussion, really. How do we prevent genocide in the future, and how do we deal with the genocide that took place through the doctrine of discovery? Especially, how do Christians make sense of this? I offer a paraphrase from C.S. Lewis. We cannot go back and change the beginning, but what we can do is start where we are now and create a different ending. Genocide was justified as a biblical imperative. People were to be made into Christians or not be recognized as people. But I believe genocide can be prevented in the future by following these steps. The first one is to remember that the Great Commission is to carry good news to people throughout the world. Also remember that the greatest commandment is to love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Never take the Great Commission into the world without the Great Commandment going along. The Great Commission without the Great Commandment is a mandate that can lead and has led to genocide. Other steps to healing. Taking responsibility for one's part in what has happened, confessing and repenting, asking for forgiveness and giving it, making amends, reconciliation, owning the sin, in other words, lamenting the sin, asking forgiveness for the sin, restoring what was lost, and moving forward together. Now, these are obviously easier to read than to do, but there's evidence that these steps work. For example, the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions of South Africa used these steps. People came in and admitted what they had done, both Black people and white people. They ended up talking together, forgiving one another, and moving forward. There was some restoration. A lot of people say you can't have reconciliation without having justice. Well, frankly, it's not likely that the present inhabitants of Malibu, California, with all their property worth millions and millions of dollars, they're probably not going to give that back to the Chumash people. And they're not likely to be giving it back to the Tongva people who lived there before. But the people of those lands can admit that the land was formerly Native, and they can get involved in projects and agencies that benefit Native people today. I don't think very many Native people talk about, asking for money. That's really not on, that's not so much what motivates our people. The land has gone, but helping to care for the land and building a relationship with those who love the land, that can go a long way. In Maine, during the contemporary era, they decided to take responsibility for something that was happening in the child adoption system, in the foster care system. And what was happening is they noticed that an extraordinary number of children in the foster care system who were Indigenous, who had records of being Indigenous, who had relatives who were Indigenous, those children were being sent to foster care and adoptive homes with white families in large numbers, to where it became apparent that either wittingly or unwittingly, and I'll put my money on wittingly, this was a variation on assimilation through boarding school. So children whose parents were unable to care for them were preferentially placed with white families. Some didn't make it back home. I'm not saying they died in their foster care homes, but they did suffer in some cases abuse, and in some cases their connection with their own families was lost. The Diocese of Maryland has set up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to deal with the matters pertaining to George Floyd's death. California has established one, but I don't think it's begun to meet yet. So the idea of truth and reconciliation, using those steps on the former slide that I showed you, these steps, owning the sin, lamenting the sin, asking forgiveness, restoring what was lost, and moving forward together. Those are the steps that undergird these truth and reconciliation commissions. Well, this comes to the end of our time. We've saved about 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes to the end. And I want to thank you once again for the time you have offered to be part of this presentation and the one last week or 2 weeks ago. I hope this stimulates you to want to know more and also helps you to understand about the doctrine of discovery and why the Episcopal Church did repudiate it in the year 2009. And because of the actions of the Episcopal Church, many other denominational Christian churches have done the same and have many, many good educational materials on the internet. Now, the big challenge is to have some word at some point from the Pope, who also repudiates what was done. That we're still waiting for. Thank you very, very much. And I look forward to talking with you over the internet or perhaps in the question period today. Thanks again for being here.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you very much for sharing that with us and for bringing that to us. Are there questions, wonderments, comments from folks? Just feel free to jump in. There are only 27 of us, so it shouldn't be too difficult. Unmute yourself and ask. I think it's interesting. Mary, the Alaska Native Settlement Claims Act was certainly a new and different strategy. Talking to people around Alaska, certainly there are different experiences of the success of that. For many, there is still a sense that it is an enculturation. In some ways, it doesn't. It supports the sort of Western monetary economy versus a more subsistence, real land stewardship model. So it is interesting. It's interesting to see that.
See, David?
The very first school system in which I taught, I was ordered by the administration that I was not to teach anything about the Jackson Indian Removal Bill or the Trail of Tears.
Yeah.
The school was located dead center in the heart of what had been the Shawnee Nation.
Oh. Yeah.
They too had their Trail of Tears. They were moved out of Ohio in the late 1830s, all the way to Oklahoma. But this was the school year was 1969, 1970.
Mhm.
And I was ordered not to even mention the Jackson Indian Removal Bill or the Trail of Tears. I did anyhow.
Good.
Good for you, David.
Yeah.
Mary, there are a couple of people who've asked some very specific questions of
Sure.
you and your presentation. One is Belle was interested in perhaps having those reconciliation steps. And Susan Mitchell was asking about the site for the Maryland case towards the end, their Truth and Reconciliation process with George Floyd. Perhaps you could send me the slides or something. I can get those. I can get those distributed to folks.
I can do that. Let me just write down what they are because I can pull those out separately. Would you say them again? One of them was
I think what would be helpful was that nice slide that has the steps towards
right.
healing.
Okay.
And then the slide that had the links to the work on reconciliation happening in Maryland. Yeah.
I have a lot on that because I interviewed the fellow from Maine who took the resolution to General Convention to encourage the establishment of Truth and Reconciliation. So I have a lot on that. That was for, well, I'll send those to you, Bishop. You have the contact info.
Thank you, Mary.
Sure. There's an amazing amount of information on the internet. If you get started looking, it's something that it can be quite overwhelming, but it's there. And I encourage you to look at it, even if it's a little at a time. Gail is asking for the information on the Little Ice Age. Is that the article? Would you like I have that. Okay. It's kind of heavy duty to pledge through it or trudge through it. They've got a lot more statistical background than I do, but it's interesting to see how they did what they did.
Well, that link for the video on that would be helpful too, I think, Mary.
Yeah, that's easy. I put that in there. I'll put the video link as well. I'm writing these down. Okay.
I would like to tell you about my experience coming to Alaska in whenever 83, I think that was.
Uh-huh.
I went to St. Philip's in Wrangell.
Uh-huh.
St. Philip's in Wrangell was established in 1904 as a break-off congregation from the Presbyterians because of the discrimination that was going on. And so the Presbyterian ministry eventually became an Episcopalian.
Uh-huh.
And so I became aware of that history. And then I looked at the congregation building. I mean, it was built on Tlingit land donated by the people. It was first called the People's Church. And they and they built the building themselves, and it still stands today. And I walked in, and there was this little white, typical Episcopal looking church that had actually nothing that would distinguish it as a congregation that was originally established so that natives and non-natives could worship together. Mm-hmm. So this bothered me as I became more aware of it. And so I talked to one of the native elders in the parish and suggested that we might need to incorporate a little native culture into our worship. Mm-hmm. And suggested that wouldn't it be nice to have a new chalice, maybe with some engravings on it. And so so she, Marge Bird, for those of you who remember her, got it together, and we got a new chalice with a eagle raven on the outside of the cup itself, the actual cup area. And it was first used as at a Christmas celebration, at which it was danced in by Marge, and with singings and presented and to be used on that Christmas celebration. And Marge got together a group of the younger children and did and at the offertory went right before the offertory, or part of the offertory, they did they had a Tlingit boat with Jesus coming in on it, and the whole thing, and then the chalice was presented by the congregation, and so then we started switching that, and there was much some people didn't come to that, and some Native people didn't come to it because they were, I think it was because they were unsure about what was right and what was wrong, and what and the whole issue is still quite alive, because that was in 83 or 80, that was in 83, 84. Yes. And so it's alive up here. I mean, the conflict between Native and non-Native understanding and how we can live together and move together is still alive here. That's all I wanted. Just wanted to tell that story.
Who is telling this story? I'm trying to match moving mouths, but I couldn't.
Oh.
Is it someone on the phone? Who just told that story?
Jan Hotsey was speaking, Mary.
Oh, Jan Hotsey.
Okay.
I just put my picture up.
Oh,
okay.
Good. Okay. Thank you, June. Thank you. Yeah, I agree with you. It's not a done deal in California either. And we're very diverse in the Diocese of Los Angeles, but there are still places where having the thought of having an Indian drum involved in the liturgy would be completely anathema. On the other hand, if you go to South Dakota or North Dakota, there are some little churches there that the altar is built upon a big drum. Wow. So we're still trying to sort it out as well. Thank you.
Well, it was quite an amazingly moving service. We had 3 clergy there for it, and it was really quite amazing. And we got through it without anybody like leaving the parish or anything. But
good. Well, I appreciate hearing that.
It was interesting. It was a very interesting event, which made me feel better. I mean, it certainly made me feel better about things, because that St. Philip's, I mean, they were involved with integrating the schools in Wrangell, so that Native children could go to the local public school. I mean, they were really quite progressive bunch.
Thank you, Jan. Caroline.
Yeah.
Oh, 5 years ago, I retired as a child protective social worker in Alaska. I worked for 15 years. And it's very much a continuing concern that Native children are removed from their homes and placed in non-Native foster homes and adopted out. And often when there are family members available, and I think one of the concerns is that we tend to get very inexperienced white social workers who are uncomfortable talking to Native people, and so they don't go out to find out the family members. They don't go out to locate them, and they assume that all Native families are incapable of caring for their children. I think I've got a family in my congregation right now that Office of Children's Services is just absolutely harassing. And there is nothing going on in that home where the children are unsafe. But I would say every 2 to 3 months we get a report. I get a call from the family. I come out. The social workers, first of all, don't know agency policy, and second of all, have absolutely no respect or regard for anybody who does not look or talk like them. At one point, the kids were removed from the home, and I had 8 members of the congregation coming to court hearings, which got the kids returned. But I mean, I really think that, you know, we can't look at this as just a historic issue. It's very much a continuing concern, and it's something that I think that the church needs to stand up and do something about. I'm tearing my hair out on this one family. You know, I've had some conversations with the social workers, and usually it's a social worker that comes in that it's like their first or second week on the job. The turnover here is outrageous. But I don't know what the church can do, and you've said some things about truth and reconciliation projects, but can the church by itself pull that off? Doesn't there have to be some kind of buy-in by the agencies and the state government?
Yes, I think what the church can do is make people aware of that form of reconciling, that there is something called a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. How does that work? There are Episcopalians who have been involved in the use of those, the people in Maine I mentioned. So there are places that one can turn to ask for help, to know where to start, because most people, it's like, I don't even know where to start with that. You know, how do I even start with that? Well, there are ways to start. And I think what the church can do, it's what I'm trying to do in this little tiny piece of it, is to just carry the word. Where we have my supervisor, Brad Hoff, who is the Indigenous missioner for the Episcopal Church, he's working on a short form of the course of Doctrine of Discovery. So right now it's just getting the word out. What is this? He and I made a presentation at an Episcopal seminary. I won't embarrass anyone by saying where it was, but there were about 90 people in the room, and we asked people to put their hand up if they had even heard the term Doctrine of Discovery. It was about 10% of the hands went up. And so it's just not something that's been in the history books. It's not something we've really been taught. So
it's not taught in the social work training either.
No.
It's just, you know, this big vacuum of information.
Well, I think that, you know, it's all about relationship. People react negatively out of fear and ignorance. If the best way to fight fear and ignorance is to have people in relationship. And I wish that there were an equal number of people here from the villages of Alaska, you know, who could tell their stories, because that would have much more credibility than my coming and talking. But it takes time, because people, they just haven't had the opportunity to, you know, to share stories. That's one of the most powerful things, I think, is sharing stories. It's how I felt when I was assigned to a homeless ministry in Riverside, California. I'm an academic, you know, I've taught in university for 30 years, worked in teacher ed, worked in special ed, counseling, etc. I didn't know anything about working with homeless people, but there was one thing I learned in seminary that stayed with me, and that's liberation theology. And in liberation theology, it says, don't go and do something to the people, do something with the people, and let them tell you what their needs are. Don't presuppose what their needs are. I thought everybody's need was going to be a house to live in. So we had this dinner and 30 homeless people came in, and I asked them the question, what can this little Episcopal church do that would make a difference in your life? And you know what they said? It wasn't, well, duh, we need housing. It was, if you could provide a place where we could sit and have coffee together and not be run off, that would change our lives more than you know. And you know, in my first trip to Alaska, that's what I saw going on at St. Matthew's, and Scott was right there in the middle of it, blessing it. And you know, that was it. He was building relationship. And when people from the parish would walk through, and they might be white folks, they might be natives, they didn't know these people, but if you keep walking through the room, you get to know the people. And then before you know it, they're your brothers and sisters in Christ. I mean, I met with my bishop on the phone this afternoon, Bishop Taylor, and he said, what are you doing for Easter at St. Michael's? I'm like, I don't know yet, because we haven't had that discussion among the people. And he said, well, if you don't have anybody coming to do baptisms, I'm not at any church for Easter this year. I'm not scheduled, because the rectors like to do their own thing. So if you need a bishop without a home to come and baptize some people, I'm available. I wouldn't have thought in 100 years for asking the bishop to come to my little neck of the woods and baptize some homeless people, but you better believe I'm going to be doing that, because his vision was bigger than mine. So it gets in relationship, by sharing stories, by sharing food, by sharing disasters sometimes, you know, giving out food to people who don't have any. It bonds you. And that's, in my years, I haven't been a priest all that long, but I've done a lot of work in the public schools with kids and their families. And if you don't have relationship, it's going nowhere. It doesn't matter the curriculum. It doesn't matter the liturgy. It's got to be people sharing their stories. That's my humble opinion. And you can do that today. See, we can do that today like this. We don't have to fly 3,000 miles. When I fly to Fairbanks, it's like flying to New York City. It's 3,000 miles straight north. But I can do it with you and get to know you and find out we have a lot in common. You know, all of us have a lot more in common than we have different. That's the beauty.
I have a suggestion.
Sure.
It would seem to me possible for you to put a doctrine of discovery on the social work, social work, counselors, psychiatrists, online learning sites for continuing education.
All we need is an invitation.
Well, I don't think you have to wait to get invited. I think you call them. Well, you know, these people who provide these things and make a proposal to make that kind of continuing ed. I know that's how we do it here in Alaska. I'm on the Drug and Alcohol Board, and you can get you can call them and say, I've got this thing, and we approve it, and there you go, and people can take the course.
Well, the Southeast District of the Office of Children's Services and Tlingit and Haida's Family and Child Services used to put on an annual ICWA conference. And I think that would be a great presentation for them. I don't know if they're still doing it, but I can find out. And by the way, I would love to be in touch with you. I don't know if you're comfortable sharing your email or.
Totally. It's very easy. mchrist@episcopalchurch.org.
Let me write that down.
And Crist doesn't have an H in it. It's Crist, not Christ.
Mary?
Enough to be Mary Crist, believe me. To be Mary Christ? Nah, probably not.
Mary,
Yeah.
Would you say just a little bit more about, you talked about the last week or the last presentation, and there's some interest by a few people to talk a little bit more about the epigenetics and the adverse childhood experiences and what's happening with that and what's new and what are some of the healing work that's being done by tribes on that?
Well, I'm certainly not an expert on it. In fact, I thought epigenetics, when I first started reading about it, was kind of a new agey, thing from science fiction, but I found out I was completely wrong. Epigenetics refers to changes in the chromosomes due to extreme stress, such as post-traumatic stress syndrome, which is basically another word for historic trauma. So for children who have been traumatized, not only over time, but often intergenerationally, there are changes in the chromosomes. I can send you some references, Bishop, for that. It's not something that dooms you forever. It's more like a predisposition to having some mental health issues or substance abuse issues or other kinds of anxiety issues. And what happens is you have that predisposition genetically, and it is passed on. And that has been shown that it's real. And what happens to cope with it is a little bit like you would figure out, well, if somebody has a predisposition to mental health issues because of the trauma in their life, then you try to have them in an environment that's not traumatic or less traumatic. It's kind of like people who inherit a predisposition to having cancer because it runs in their family, quote unquote. They don't always get cancer. And it has to do with the term, I think it's how it's expressed, whether it will be expressed or not genetically. So I do have some articles that are readable. There are some Indigenous people that work in that field professionally, and I can send those to the bishop as a follow-up. It's a very interesting, it's a fascinating area because it says, well, no wonder there are so many Native people. I mean, the suicide rate is obscene among especially Native adolescents. Well, when you think about what everybody's dealing with anyway as an adolescent, and then you're coming perhaps out of an environment where the parents have been dealing with that, have not been parented in any stress-free type of environment, that gets passed on. And then just what I would call, normal, if there is normal teenage stress, that gets exaggerated epigenetically. And so those genes express themselves and our people become very vulnerable to those kinds of substance abuse, suicide. I mean, suicide particularly, it's, as you know, I mean, you live in Alaska. If you have anything to do with the villages, it's a major problem. And it's a major problem, not just in the villages of Alaska. I had a woman in the talking circle this very week in LA, in our Zoom talking circle, lost a nephew to suicide. And she said, we didn't see it coming. We didn't see it coming. Well, we don't typically see it coming, but it's there. So yeah, I have some references I can send. That it is a legitimate phenomenon where our genes are affected by intergenerational trauma. And that's anyone, not just Native kids. I mean, that's any of us. So.
Well, Mary, it's you've been very generous with your time with us. It's a little after 10, or a little after 10. It's 10 after 5. I don't know. It's probably 10 o'clock somewhere. Not here and not where you are. I want to again thank you. I also want to say, in the hearing of the clergy that are here, that I know that you are very much willing to continue
Sure.
as a resource to us here. Mary serves as the Indigenous Theological Education Coordinator for the Episcopal Church, as we've said already. And I think she wants us to consider her a resource for that work. This presentation is will be available on our YouTube site, but also if you go to the Bexley Seabury Pathways program, you'll find that this is a course that's being offered through the Bexley Seabury Pathways program. And it's free, and it's available to folks who might be interested in hearing more. But I also would remind all of us that you are the church. So when we say the church should do this and the church should do that, I think it's important for us to help spread the word, as Mary said, get our people in our local communities involved and aware. I am so grateful for people at St. Brendan's and under your leadership, Carolyn, that they were advocates with people who are seeking justice for child placement. And of course, all the work that Jan spoke of, both in Wrangell, but also in Haines, and all of you have been doing. I think we should continue the conversation, and I invite you to gather people in your parishes and your congregations to perhaps watch the videos that are now available and to engage the conversation. I don't want to go too far out and overcommit Mary, but I bet she would be willing to at least entertain invitations to join folks on a Zoom conversation about this.
Sure. Sure.
You will see on the Facebook site, our group site on the Facebook, there is a Zoom link to the Office of Indigenous Ministries office hours. Brad Hoff has regular Zoom gatherings on Wednesdays, and those are, you are invited to join those. Mary is always on those and as a resource. Let's continue to share these resources and share the word. And again, just thank you, Mary, for your leadership and your generosity.
Well, you're more than welcome. It's a real honor and a privilege, and I have my points are ready to be spent on Alaska Airlines.
Yeah.
I have lots of points, and the bishop knows that I have hinted every way known to man for an invitation, which he has extended, but we have to figure out the best way to use the time and when it's safe to do it. He can't go out to villages when we're under the circumstances. But the good news is I am getting my second shot on Monday, and so is my husband. So who knows, maybe sometime we'll meet up in your beautiful, beautiful state. So,
and I am acutely aware, Mary, and we can look at the people who are just in this call. We are underrepresented by our native Alaska Native and Indigenous clergy, or at least leaders here. And I think that would be we are diminished by their lack of their presence on this forum. So we can look for ways to perhaps make those conversations happen as well.
That would be wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be absolutely wonderful. Well, I've enjoyed meeting all of you because I haven't met anyone from the southern part of Alaska. And I've only met people in the villages and in Fairbanks. So this is a real treat to get to see all of you and to have a chance to have a conversation. I mean, that's the beauty of this technology. We'd never be able to do this without it. We just wouldn't have the money to do it. So this is building relationship. It's what I was talking about. And when we can get to where we can build this kind of relationship and storytelling with the villages easily, when that technology allows, that'll be even greater. One time we went to Hughes, to the village for Easter, and we walked in and there was an elder who was dressing out a beaver, and he was on closed, well, I don't know if it's right to call it closed circuit, but it was state-of-the-art video, and it was being sent out to 3 other villages. And a little girl in school in Huslia goes like, "It's Mary and Will. What are you doing here?" You know, and we had just flown in from California. We're sitting in Hughes watching a beaver be dressed out culturally, appropriately, beautifully, liturgically. And here's a little, you know, little girl in Huslia watching it. I mean, so one of the things the bishop and I were talking about is it possible to get some kind of a partnership with the public schools to be able to use that equipment that is sitting in the village schools to be able to, for this kind of purpose. We might not be able to call it church related. It might have to be called cultural enrichment, or, you know, history or doctrine of discovery. But if we could pull that off, then this number would double in a heartbeat. Yeah. So there's always hope.
Amen. Amen.
Yeah.
Well,
so God bless you.
I would also put in a pitch for to our clergy to remind you the Sacred Ground program is extraordinary. It's a very good program. It is the kind of program, just like the Doctrine of Discovery, that you know, working through the time that the church, the Episcopal Church, repudiated the Doctrine of Discovery, and then being on site with a lot of the talk about what do we do with it now. You know, in many ways it was frustrating because it was put onto the shoulders of the Indigenous community to develop and fund how this what's really Anglo history is taught and shared, and you know, this is very much part of our Anglo-Western history, and part that many of us perhaps never learned. And I think it's important that we hear the stories, and this and Sacred Ground are wonderful, wonderful ways to do that, to engage it. It's tough stuff. Not everybody's going to want to hear it, but I think it's important to introduce it. So thank you, Mary.
You're welcome. My pleasure. God bless.
God bless you.
Lent. See you another time.
Look forward to it.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.